Welcome back to Queen City Corals. Today we are going to be showing you guys how we dip and intake new corals, and we just got a shipment in, so I figured I'd show you guys all the steps we go through and all the procedures we use to make sure all of our corals come in clean and happy. So now that we've got the corals unpacked, we're ready to start our dip. So our first step in the dip is going to be Reef Dip, but you can use any iodine. This is basically going to be where we remove any pests and get them off of the coral. Iodine is usually light enough where it won't harm the coral too much, and we'll use it on a lot of corals that don't have a lot of pests, like Cinerinas and Acanthophilias that have more flesh and are a little more sensitive to stronger dips, like our next one, which is going to be Coral RX. We use the Coral RX Pro, which is a more concentrated variety. This just lets us get more out of a single dip. However, at home, you guys can use this Coral RX One Shot. We have this available in store or online. This is really great because it allows you to just dip one little batch of corals. It dips 1 gallon, and it's a really quick and easy way to dip without having to measure, making sure you're getting the perfect amount. This is really a great dip. Coral RX is my favorite dip to use for removing pests. It does a really good job of not just getting the pests agitated enough to come off the coral, but it'll actually kill them as well. The last thing that you need to watch out for when you're dipping corals is you want to watch for eggs. So the way we do that is through inspecting the corals, and I'll also go through with a scalpel, as you'll see in a moment, to ensure that anything that's not a part of the coral gets removed from the base so that it doesn't get into our tanks, and make sure everything is clean. For both of these dips, we're gonna do 5 minutes. So it makes it real easy because you can do 2 batches of coral at once. And then after these 2 dips, we're gonna move them into our regular tank water. So this basically just rinses off any dip that are left on the corals so it doesn't get into our tank and harm our invertebrates or any of our corals that are in there already. So now we're gonna add our Reef Dip. So with this, I am going for a hue that is a little bit darker than this. So we want our iodine dip to look about like this, where there's a little bit of an orange tint to it. That makes sure that there is enough in there that it will irritate any pests, but not too much where it will agitate the corals. Next are Coral RX. So for this amount in the Pro, this is 2 gallons here. We're going to be using 2 syringes. And after we've added our dip, we're gonna swirl it around and make sure it's nice and mixed in. And now that we've got both of our dips ready, we're going to add the corals in for 5 minutes in each before rinsing them off in our clean saltwater bath and placing them into the tank. So now we're placing our corals into our bath. And now that they're in here, we're going to start our timer. And I'm going to grab the scalpel and go through and inspect these. I will typically remove anything that appears organic, so that is not the coral. So anything like that. Also, something that's common, as you can see here, is bubble algae. So all you have to do with that is pop it off. A lot of people think that bubble algae, if you pop it, will release spores. And that's partially true. It's not the water inside of the bubble algae, but it's actually the film around that. So all of this pieces, so if I were to cut this up, these outside pieces will actually spread the bubble algae. And that's why things like emerald crabs are able to eradicate it, because they'll actually eat around the whole algae. So the next thing I'm looking for is any signs of bite marks or stressors on the coral. That's another really good way to indicate whether or not there are any pests on it. And I don't see anything on these zoas here. which is good. Typically with these guys, we're looking for bite marks from something like a zoa eating spider. I'm also going to be looking for any eggs, and once we move it to the Coral RX dip, if anything comes off, any pests like any spiders or any nudibranchs, I will be able to tell more easily if there are things like eggs in there, especially if there are any adult pests that come off. There's typically going to be eggs because they've already laid some. But these, other than a little bit of bubble algae, look really clean, which is definitely good. Sometimes when corals are open up, it's a lot harder to see their tissue and whether or not they're doing well. So all of these guys, just like the other rock there, are looking clean. I don't see any bubble algae on this rock, which is good. So we're gonna move on to our third rock here. And this rock has a lot of interesting things on it. Actually has a hammer on here as well. It's got some sponge, so you might see some of this orange stuff. This is just sponge. This is harmless. Eventually, actually, the corals will grow over it, so there's nothing to worry about there. There is a little bit of detritus on here, as well as some more sponges. Again, they're harmless. You can take them off if you don't like the look of them, but they aren't going to hurt your corals or do anything bad to them. It's all just cosmetic. And you definitely want to make sure you're also looking at the bottom of these corals. So on this one, you can see some of the zoas are under here. There's actually even some sort of clam here. This is a clam or a mussel, some sort of bivalve. So there's a lot of stuff you can find on here that's really cool. A lot of times. I've got what looks like could be a feather duster or a vermitid snail, and so I'll remove that. And it looks like some more sponges. Usually any of this yucky looking stuff, if it can be very easily scraped off, is just a sponge, as is the case with this one. So I'll scrape a little bit of it off, but it's completely harmless, and I'm really just scraping it off so that way the zoas can grow over it a little bit easier, and that way they won't get, they'll have a little bit more space to grow. So another important thing to do is to look in your dip once you've completed it. That's why we use these white containers here, because it makes it really easy to see if there are any pests left in the water. And looking over this, I don't see any pests that have come off. So now that we have our corals moved over into the other container, we're going to look at this dip container. We use these white ones because it's a lot easier to see what came off of them. And looking at this dip, I don't see anything harmful that came off in this dip, which is definitely a good sign. We'll need to look it over again in the Coral RX, but so far these corals are looking clean and ready to go into the system. So now that this dip is empty, we're going to add some other corals in here. These are some torches that we had in our quarantine system because we found some pests on them, and now this is going to be our third dip, so we are ready to move these into our main system as long as this dip is also successful and we don't find anything in here. So what we're looking at here is the flesh of this torch coral, and typically when you have a torch coral that has pests on it, this flesh will be reseeded. This flesh is nice and healthy, so that's a good sign that it doesn't have any pests on it. And with these guys, we're basically just going to look around the base for any flatworms or eggs, and this piece looks nice and clean, so this piece is good to continue dipping. And grab our next piece here, and same thing, I'm just going to go along the base with this small scalpel and ensure that there are no pests on here. And again, looking at that flesh, this piece looks really healthy. And so now we'll move on to our next piece and looking for any pests that come off of it as well. So this piece also looks clean. And before we remove these pieces, we're gonna make sure that we give them a nice little shake. That's just going to dislodge any pests that are still on them. And again, I'm just going through and scraping at anything that might be an organic creature that we don't want in our tank that could cause some harm to us. But again, all of these pieces so far look nice and clean, which is very good. So our next step is going to be fragging down our Euphyllia and getting the bases removed, because a lot of the pests will end up living on those bases, and removing those bases is the easiest way to get rid of things like eggs, as well as some of the other pests. So first thing is to put on our glasses as well as our gloves. So now that we've got our safety equipment on, we're going to get our after cutting dip ready. So what we do is we add a little bit of iodine into some of our tank water. And what this does is it helps prevent any nicks or cuts from getting infected from any bacteria or any other harmful things. And it also helps the coral recover from any stress it encountered while we were cutting it. So next we're going to start cutting the Euphyllia. I've got a frog spawn here, and I'll show you how I'm going to cut it. So basically anywhere there's the flesh, you don't want to cut. So I'm gonna cut right here to make this a frag, then I'll cut this in half, and then I'll rinse them off in water, and then I'll place them in the dip before we get ready to glue them onto a plug. So our next step is going to be gluing the frags. It's very important that you have a towel so you can dry it down. So once we make sure that our frag plug is dry, we're going to take our frog spawn frag and we're going to pat the bottom dry and make sure that it's not dripping too much. And then we'll take our glue, put a glob on there, and then once everything's dry, we'll move it around. And then what I like to do next is dip it in the water, because the water will actually help the glue cure. So that way it starts to begin to cure. And then once you leave it in the air for a couple of minutes, usually about 30 seconds to 1 minute, it'll be good to go. And the glue will be hardened and we can move it into the tank. So now that our frags are nice and clean, we're ready to put them in the tank to get them ready for sale. We are going to come back to these zoas. So these guys have just finished up their 5-minute dip in the Coral RX. And as you can see, I'm going to shake it pretty vigorously just to make sure that nothing comes off of here. And if it does, we will be able to see it and inspect it. And I'm gonna give one more look over this piece just to make sure I didn't miss anything in my first pass. So it looks like a couple of pieces of bubble algae here, so we want to get rid of those. But other than a little bit of algae, I don't see any eggs or any pests or even any signs of pests like bite marks or recession. All these polyps look nice and full, which is what you want to see. I don't see any bleached polyps or discoloration. They all look nice and healthy. And finally, we're gonna look at the back, and the back looks good. So we'll give it one more good shake in this water, and we're gonna move it into our clean salt water. Before we put these guys into our tanks, we're gonna look over this dip water one more time to make sure there's nothing in here. And it looks like the only thing I see is gonna be a bristleworm. These guys are really normal in the reef tanks. Pretty much every tank has them, even if you can't see them. They get a bad rap because a lot of times people will see them feasting on their dead corals or their dead fish, and they'll assume that they killed them. But these guys are actually detritivores, so very similar to snails in that
They'll eat dead things already, but they won't actually kill them. You can see there the spines on this guy, but they won't harm your tank or your corals or your fish or anything like that. They really only pose a threat to you. The only real way to get rid of them is to add a predator like a 6-line wrasse or an arrow crab that will eat them. But even those guys most likely aren't going to 100% eradicate your issue. So it's best to just manually remove them when you see them, and be careful when you're putting your hands in the tank, because sometimes they like to live underneath rocks. So people will go to grab a rock out of their tank and there will be one of these guys sitting underneath it and they'll get stung by it. It is painful. It's not going to be the end of the world, but they are definitely not fun to interact with.
And typically with corals that are dirtier like this, we'll dip them and let them sit in quarantine for a little while and then move them into our sail tanks. So these guys we actually got in earlier in the week. We dipped them when they came in, and we had them sitting in our quarantine tank for a few days, and just in case anything like an egg hatched, and now we've dipped them again and moved them over here, so that way I can be certain that there's no pests in there, and make sure that everything stays nice and clean in our display tanks. We really try to make sure that there aren't any pests in here, not only because we try to sell high quality corals that are nice and healthy, but also because we have our own systems here where we grow corals, so we don't want anything infesting our own corals, which is part of why we go through such lengthy precautions to ensure the health of our corals and that they don't have any pests on them as well.